Hey friends, welcome back. This is the continuation from last episode or last video where we were talking about managed instance. We created a managed instance and we saw what are the virtual network requirements, the subnet requirements, how to set up the subnet and how to validate and prepare your virtual network for a deployment. We deployed the SQL managed instance successfully, and we were using the free tier that was recently launched by Microsoft for us to start using it. So our managed instance is ready, and it's time to deep dive into how the architecture looks, and we'll just quickly go through the architecture and we will see how you can connect to that managed instance later in this video. So let's start with the architecture diagram. This is a high level architecture diagram. Let me zoom it a bit. And if you see my screen, when you deploy a SQL managed instance, you use your virtual network, you use a subnet, and if you are connected to that virtual network via a VPN, or you have a Bastion server, or any other server sitting in that virtual network or connected to that virtual network, you should be able to connect to the managed instance directly, privately. There are two options. One is via the public endpoint, and the other is privately. You can connect the private endpoint in two ways. It's not the private endpoint, but privately in two ways, and we'll go through that. First, let's see what the architecture looks like, the high level connectivity architecture. As you see my screen, so a virtual cluster gets deployed in your subnet. So this is your SQL MI subnet, and you get a virtual cluster created. It exposes a public endpoint, a private endpoint, and you can use that to connect. There are couple of concepts that we need to understand here. So let's go to the connectivity bit, the communication overview. So if you see my screen right now, this SQL managed instance has got a VNet local endpoint and a public endpoint. So VNet local endpoint is actually a private endpoint that gets created. It's not a private endpoint, but it's kind of a endpoint that gets created by default when you deploy a managed instance in your subnet, and you can use that to connect privately. And then other one is a public endpoint. Obviously, as it's a database, best practice, always disable the public endpoint, use the private connections only. So you'll be using the VNet local endpoint, or you can use the private endpoints. We'll look into that. So before we start our video where we connect to the instance and do a few queries, let's see the three options that you have. You can connect to the public endpoint. We will do that as well. There are certain NSG network security group requirements that you need to consider when you want to connect to public endpoint, and as a best practice, you should not connect to the public endpoint and the private endpoints, which is the most secure way of connecting to the managed instance. So let's see what a VNet local endpoint is. So it's a default means to connect to SQL instance, and this is how your FQDN or fully qualified name would look like. The managed instance name followed by DNS zone and then database.windows.net that resolves to an IP address from the subnet's address pool, hence the VNet local. So the subnet that you have used, for example, let's go to my setup, and this is our virtual network. So this particular subnet which we used, where we deployed our managed instance. So the fully qualified name for the managed instance would resolve to a private IP that will be from this particular subnet space. So the subnet is currently 10.0.0./24, and an IP will be assigned from this particular IP range. And yeah, so that's your VNet local endpoint, and that's by default. You don't have to do anything once you have deployed a managed instance successfully, and if you are connected to the virtual network, you should be able to resolve this SQL endpoint, the VNet local endpoint. And the VNet local endpoint can be used to connect standard. So yeah, that's exactly what we talked about. Always use its domain name as an underlying, as the underlying IP address can occasionally change. So yeah, if you see our instance, this is our fully qualified name, VNet local. So this is your instance name, this is your DNS zone that it created, and then the database dot windows dot net. This is what you will be using to connect to the database or the instance. Currently our instance is stopped, so that's what they meant when they said the IP can change. If you restart your server, the IPs might change. That's why it's recommended to use the fully qualified domain name. That's exactly what we'll be doing. The public endpoint, the endpoint name will have a, if you see this, the instance name, mi name dot public dot DNS zone dot database dot windows dot net. So that's the fully qualified name that you'll use to connect to the public IP or the public endpoint. This resolves to the internet. Yes, so it exposes your database to internet. Best practice: never use this. Always disable the public endpoint. This is one of the requirements. So for having public endpoint, the port that it is using is 3342, and you'll need to make sure that NSG allows traffic through this port. So that's something that you need to keep in mind. As it says, private endpoint is an optional fixed IP address. So what you can do is you can actually create a private endpoint in your hub network, or you have a separate subnet for private endpoints where you manage all the private endpoints. So you can create a private endpoint there and then use that as a you add that in your DNS zones and you connect using that. So you can do that. There are certain things that you need to keep in mind if you are using private endpoints. One thing is not to use the DNS zone dot database dot windows dot net, because it has a conflict existing endpoint which is VNet local endpoint. So we will see that in action. And one thing to note, whenever you are connecting to the managed instance, always use the fully qualified name, because the IP sometimes the IPs can change in case of VNet only. In private endpoints, connecting via private IP address isn't supported. So always use the fully qualified domain name for your managed instance. So let's get started. This is the managed instance that we deployed in the last video. If you have not watched it yet, I'll share the link here somewhere. Just go ahead and watch the video from the beginning. So this is our managed instance that has been successfully deployed. This is the screen that this is the landing page for a managed instance. But yeah, let's first connect to this managed instance using SQL Server Management Studio. Let me open my SQL Server Management Studio. Make sure you have the latest SQL version of SQL Server Management Studio, because there are certain patching there are certain versions that do not support SQL Managed Instance if you're using an older version of SSMS. So better to use latest version of your SSMS. Okay, so let's go ahead, and as you can see, my reset password option was disabled, so I have just enabled SQL Authentication so I can reset my password. I am just doing this to use SQL Authentication to connect and show you how you can use that. But yeah, as a good practice, I would avoid user password based authentication and mostly use your Azure Active Directory or Entra ID based authentication. So this is the VNet local endpoint, and I am not using any kind of VPN. I'm not enabled express route. Obviously, I don't have. This is not even a Bastion host. It's my local laptop, so we should not be able to connect to this VNet local endpoint. Let me, even though we cannot, I know we cannot connect. Let me try and then resolve issues as we face the issues. Let's use the admin account. We'll also connect using the Azure Active Directory or the Entra ID authentication. As you can see, the instance cannot be found because obviously we are not connected to the virtual network yet, so we cannot use the VNet local endpoint. This is the section where in the networking section in security, where you'll see the public endpoint. As you can see, the public endpoint is currently enabled, and it talks about the port 3342 that should be allowed in your NSG. We have our public endpoint enabled. As a best practice, never enable this. Make sure you have it disabled. But we will be using first this public endpoint to connect and show you how you can configure it. So if you see my screen, Microsoft tells you that you need to have this inbound NSG rule in place for 3342. So that's something we will need to do. Let's go back and copy the endpoint. And let's go back to NSG and see what's there. Let's add our 3342 port. We will just use my public IP. I don't want the entire internet to be able to connect to that port. That should be good. So we have added that port 3342 in our NSG allowed inbound rules. And now if we use the public endpoint, we should be able to connect. And now that the inbound rule is in place, we should be able to connect. Maybe it's taking some time. Let me click again. So yeah, there you go. If you see my screen, the name of our endpoint has a public, so we are connecting to the public endpoint, and we have also got the port number in our the host name, the server name that we supplied in the SQL Server Management Studio connection dialog box. So we have our instance, we have connected our instance successfully. We have connected using SQL authentication. Let's do the same with our Entra ID. I've added my account and sign in, verify, and that should be it. I should be able to connect using my Entra ID authentication. So we have used SQL authentication and Entra ID authentication and connected successfully to the public endpoint. So we have currently connected to the public endpoint of our SQL managed instance, which I will not recommend. So if I disable this, or sorry, if I disable SQL authentication, so you need to go to Microsoft Entra admin section and enable your Microsoft Entra authentication only. Once that is done, SQL authentication will not be allowed. And if I go back and try to refresh or connect again using SQL authentication, I should get an error. Login failed. Azure Active Directory only authentication is enabled. That is exactly the case. So yeah, everything is working as expected. I am still seeing an error in terms of service principal. We will resolve that. But for now, let's quickly go and create a database. So we are creating a database from Management Studio, and then we will create it from the portal. We will do both, and we'll see, both of them works or not. So let me do it from SQL Server Management Studio. Let me create a database, add an owner, and it should be okay. Select, okay, and yeah, click OK. That's fine. Compatibility level, let's do it 2012. I mean, it's 2022. I'm still in the old SQL Server 2012 days. Collation, I'll leave it default. So yeah, that's it. It should create the database. As you can see, the database skill builder zone underscore dev is created successfully. Let's do the same from the portal. Let's go and refresh the portal. You can already see that we can see the database from the portal as well. Let's quickly create a database here. So you can do it either ways. You can either do it from here, or you can create it from SQL Server Management Studio or any of the clients that you're using to connect to Azure SQL Managed Instance. So let's create this. Region is fine. Create. It should create the database. Deployment successful. So we should be able to see this in our SSMS as well. It's there. Let's go back to SSMS and quickly refresh the database section. Yeah, so the database is visible on your SSMS as well. So we have successfully created a database both from the portal as well as SQL Server Management Studio. Now let's work on creating a login. So as you would have done that in an on-premise SQL Server, first you create a login. Login is at the instance level, and then you use that login to create users at the database level. So let's quickly create an Azure Active Directory authenticated user. So if I want to, so let me enter my email address or my user principal name. Once that is done, I should be able to assign some permissions. But the thing is, I've already got this user in my login, so I should not be able to add it again. Obviously, I should not be able to create a login again. I should get an error. Server identity does not have AAD readers permission. So what's happening here is the SQL managed instance does not have permissions to do anything on your Azure Active Directory or your Entra ID. For that, what you need is a service principal that is assigned to your SQL Server. So you use your SQL Server's identity to get permissions at the Azure AD directory. So directory reader permission is enough. If I want to create a SQL authenticated user, there should be no problem, because for that you don't need access to your Azure Active Directory. Let me create a test user with some permissions. I don't want to enforce any policies because this is just a demo, and yeah, it's always good to enforce some policies. That's my database. I'll give it some permissions and click OK. It should successfully create the user. So that is, it will create the login. Then you can use that login to create your user. And if we go, this is a error message that pops up. Managed instance needs a service principal to access the Entra ID, which is, let's add the principal. You need permissions at the you need permissions of global admin to do this. If you see, it says click here to grant read permissions to your managed instance, and we have done that. Once it is done, it should be able to read our users from the Entra ID or Azure Active Directory. Let's go back to our intra ID. These are the users that have permissions at directory readers role. So the managed instance has got the permissions. Now we should be able to create a Azure Active Directory authenticated users. Let me quickly go back to managed instance, and if I try to create, it has got the permission, so it should be able to create the user. But the thing is, the login already exists, so I would still expect an error. The server principal already exists, exactly what we wanted to see. So let's create an AAD user, or use another account to create a login. So let me click OK, and this time let's do it using the script. If I click on script, it should generate me the script. If you see the script, it's create login name from external provider. That's when you want to create a Azure Active Directory or Entra ID authenticated login. You need to give the from external provider. So that's done. Let's quickly execute this. User is created. Let me refresh the login. I can see the login created successfully. Now based on this login, you can create the user at a database level. Let me switch. If you see the properties, currently it doesn't have any permissions because we have just created the login. It doesn't exist as a user in any of the databases. So you can either do it from this the UI, or you can just do it from T-SQL, or we will be doing via T-SQL. So let's change the context of the query use of the script. So use skill builder zone underscore dev, go create user. I don't want to create I can just use the same name, that's fine. Create user this from login. Yep, so that should do the job. So it will create a user in my database. It has successfully completed. I created in dev. Oh, I have not executed it. Let me execute that. Execute successfully. Let me refresh. And yep, so the user now exists at the database level. Still, it doesn't have any permissions. It's not assigned to any of the roles. I would be assigning it to the data reader permission, db underscore data reader. For now, only this particular user has got the permissions. Let me add the newly created Entra authenticated user to have permissions at the database level. So I'll run this store proc sp underscore add role member. So you can add members to any of the database built-in roles. So I will be using db underscore data reader. Actually, you can use any of the built-in roles. db data reader is fine, and I'll assign this user, and that should be fine. Script ran successfully. Now if I go and see the role, I can see the user has permissions. So yeah, that was a quick video on connecting to the public endpoint and then creating users, creating login, granting the permissions. So this is where you will see your retention policies, and you can configure the database backups. Default is 7 days. You can increase it to 35 days. But if you see my screen, that setting is currently disabled, and that's because we are using the free tier, the freemium SQL Server or the freemium managed instance. So that's why we don't see those settings available for us. So yeah, that's one of the limitations for the free tier, and we should quickly have a look at all the limitations of the free tier. And if you see the backup retention, it is 0 to 7 days for short-term retention. And yeah, so that's your limitation, and we cannot change anything. So let's yeah, that's it for today's video. We connected to the public endpoint, we created logins, users, granted some permissions, saw the limitation in terms of backup, and yeah, thanks for watching and stay tuned for the next video. Thank you.